This text from Deuteronomy is the core, isn't it, of what faith in God is about. Deuteronomy was written many centuries after the experience of Sinai, and written for the view that people had forgotten what that experience of Sinai was all about, how they were to shape their lives, to listen, to attune their ear, not just to words, but to attune their whole personhood to the vision of God, to the person of God, to the wholeness of who God was for them. Exodus 34 says that as Moses finds himself in a difficult place where the people are grumbling and griping and complaining, he says, God, you've got to do something. And God says, come up here once again on the mountain, and I will show you who I am. And one could think of this fantastic revelation, this encounter with the divine. But what Moses experiences is a voice that says to him, slow to anger, rich in mercy. God is slow to anger, rich in mercy, abounding in kindness, steadfast in love. In other words, stop your complaining and start being slow to anger, rich in mercy, abounding in kindness, steadfast in love. If you want to know who I am, then do these things. Even in Deuteronomy, many centuries later, when people had simply thought that the ritual and following the rules was all they had to do, and God would bless them, and God would protect them from harm, Deuteronomy reminds them powerfully what they are to be about. Not just do, but who they are to be. You can imagine in saying, love God with your heart, your mind, your soul, all your personhood. It is not just the brains that are to say the words, love God, but it is the values, the way that you live, the interaction that you have with other people. This is how it is to be. I often think about it. That means that from the tip of your toes to whatever hair I might have on the top of my head, that's how much the love that God is to fill our lives, to shape our lives. You need to see, right, that if that is the core of the tradition, if that is the core of the belief, is that if that's the way that we are to live, there can be no room in us for hate. If we are so filled with the love of God, then hate and anger and any thought about violence cannot be present. Because if there is, then we are not of God. We are not in God. We are not about the way of God in the world. And said specifically to the family, right? Put this on the doorpost of your house. In fact, I've even seen in Israel that they've got little magnetic mezuzahs that go on your car, so that in getting into your car, maybe I need one of those, because sometimes when I get into the car, I am a raving lunatic and driving. Put this in your car. When I'm in Israel next June, I'll buy one and put it in my car so when I get in, that even there in that space. But you can see it, right? Going out to remind yourself, going into the house to remind yourself. This is what it is about. It's a way, as Deuteronomy is to say, that maybe that we've left it up to other people to show us or to tell us what God is about. That if it's not in the midst of our community, one to another, that we are teaching this, but not just teaching it for it to be words, but practicing it, then you see how easy it is to forget it. Remember when we were kids, that how many times we had to be told to do something? It's like once we get past 70, we have to go back to being a kid and be reminded over and over and over again. Well, okay, because sometimes we forget, because the world around us is very powerful in terms of its hate or violence or prejudice. And sometimes we have to be reminded who we are and who it is that we are to model towards others, God. And of course, as it moves, that tradition moves into the story of Jesus, right? Someone says, what's the most important of all the laws? And this is the commandment, he repeats, love God with everything that you had. And you know what? That wasn't just some idea. Right from the beginning of Jesus' ministry, people came to see the embodiment of God's love in his life. That everyone that he touched became whole again. Why? Because he did so not with judgment or condemnation or scorn or ridicule. He touched people with God's love, and they were made whole. Their lives were being lifted up. They were once again walking in the way of God. So that in Jesus' life, it was clear that these weren't just words, but they were to be actions. It was to be the way that his disciples, his followers, could carry on his presence in the midst of the world. Once Jesus leaves, what do? Well, do what he did. And it's interesting that as Luke tells the story of the, quote, Beatitudes, that he says it clearly. This is not about the future. Matthew sets up the Beatitudes as if some part out there in the future, these things will happen. Luke says it happens now. If you are hungry, you will be filled now. If you are grieving and mourning, you will find consolation now. It's happening now. Why? Because the community is energized and motivated to be the very extension of God's love to each other. That's why it happens now. It's not an individual, private thing that we do. It's the way that we are community for one another, with one another, but not only for us in ourselves inside the walls of this building, but for the world. Where the world comes to know that hate and violence and prejudice will not be tolerated. That it will be compassion and love and forgiveness and healing and making people whole again. That's what God's vision is for the world. And Luke warns people because it's like we can become very self-satisfied about the blessings and forget that the woes, and this is very ancient. Luke's pattern of the Beatitudes is following a very ancient thing. Lest you think that it's only about blessings and you become self-satisfied and begin to kind of, isn't that good? I've got all of these things. Just woe to you, watch out. It's to warn us. Warn us so we don't become proud or arrogant. But we're always in the humility, in the humbleness, not humility per se, but humbleness, in our realization that it is only when, not only that we are captured by God, but when we are engaging one another in the vision of God in terms of compassion and mercy and a hunger and thirst for justice. Notice how Luke ends it. In Matthew's version is much more extensive. This is how you are to treat one another. It's disturbing to me to hear some people who make claims to be Christian who seem to justify violence. Who say it's okay if you beat people up. It's okay if you turn your back on people who are in need. Remember in the Beatitudes just now it said, those sound like false teachers, aren't they? We need to be very careful because there's lots of people who are making claims about being teachers of wisdom. But they don't represent the God that we believe in, or the example of Jesus. Nor is it the way that the community needs to be shaped and formed by God's love and compassion and mercy. Each one of those things of turning the other cheek, that each one of those points is that there's an alternative reaction and response that we are asked to make when we are confronted by hate or violence or anger. Because we know that if in response to hate and anger and violence that we engage in that very same anger, that we are no different. And the invitation is to be different. I have to be honest with you, when I was growing up, both my parents worked, so my grandmother was the one who was at home, and I'm convinced that my grandmother indeed, at the moment of her death, became a saint, because she had to put up with me growing up. Right? There are probably people in your lives, right? I'm just convinced this person became a saint because to put up with me all of their life, they just had to be a saint, right? And she was. But I'm not so sure that maybe when you're a little kid that you kind of misunderstand some things that were said, that I would come home crying because some bully in the neighborhood had tried to beat me up, and I would just come home crying. She said, "Stop crying! Stand up for yourself!" Well, when you're 7 years old, you think that means beat the other person up. And I did. I did that really well. I beat them up. They never touched me or fooled with me again. Because I was always the shortest, and I didn't care how tall they might have been or how big they were. I would lay into them, and they would run, and I would laugh. I think I misunderstood what she was saying about that. Not until I became an adult did I realize that to stand up for myself meant, in the sense of what the prophets invite us to consider, is to stand up against injustice and prejudice and hate. Because the world can't be transformed and changed if it only thinks that to solve problems and to resolve conflict is by blowing people up and dropping bombs. That only causes more harm. The invitation, and this is our legacy. This has to be our legacy. Meaning that years from now, and I hope this is true. I haven't done a survey, and we all probably are tired of taking polls and surveys over the past few weeks and months. But I hope that when you're gone, when we're gone, that our grandchildren, children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, even if they're not going to church, will say, my grandmother, my grandfather showed me by her life, by his life, what God's love is all about. I know it's true for me. My grandmother was the one who taught me to pray. She showed me how to pray. But I still remember that 63 years later. Tells me that's her legacy in my life. My father, I know I shared this, my father was not a churchgoer. And I could never tell if he even believed in God, because he never talked about it. But during the year and a half that he was unemployed, he went into a bakery every Sunday morning after they had sold their stuff and cleaned the ovens for that bakery. When you're 10 years old, all you know about your father's unemployment, not knowing the financial stress that put upon our family, but the freezer was full of baked goods. Because he got to take home what they didn't sell. Years later, I finally figured out that was a tremendous act of love on his part. Because he did that for his family. He did it for his family. My mother was one who, during the year that she had cancer, that sometimes, again, you know how you look at people, and I just would see her sitting on the couch. And I couldn't tell if she was in pain or suffering, but she would sit there, and I perceived her as being, she was feeling sorry for herself. That was to be expected, right, if you're suffering with cancer. I said, Mom, get up and do something. If you got up and did something, you might not feel that way. here I was in the seminary already. And she said, if I felt like it, I would. And I didn't get it. I had all of the theology and all of the scripture, and I didn't get it. But later, in thinking about it, she never complained. She never complained about the pain that she suffered. And I remember just a few days before she died, I was at the hospital, and she was on pretty high dose of morphine. So it was kind of semi-conscious. And I was getting ready to leave the hospital. There was no hospice back then. And I leaned over the bed, and I kissed her, and I said, I love you. And her eyes opened, and she said, I love you too. Those are the last words that she spoke. That I can talk about that is the legacy of my grandmother, my father, and my mother in my life. And I know you all have those stories. We have many of the saints that we can tell those stories about. We do what we do here in this congregation. We make the pledges and commitments that we do in stewardship. We do all of these things so that the legacy of our lives will be remembered by those who come after us. That it is not about the building. It is about the example of faith and love and compassion and commitment to justice and that hunger and thirst to make the world different than what it is. That's the legacy. That's the vision that we have. And if you're going around in Chandler and Sun Lakes, do you hear anybody talking about that? It's maybe because we're quiet about it. The legacy only happens when not only action flows from our words, but we are willing to give witness and bear testimony to it. I mentioned at the beginning that the early community honored the places where the martyrs had died. You know what the Greek word for martyr means? Bear witness. To be a martyr means to give witness to what you know to be true. And what we know to be true, God is love. And that with every ounce of our being, we will love no matter what. And we will invite, this is our legacy, we will invite others into the journey with us to love fully, totally, completely, and to work to bring peace, justice, compassion to our world. That